they don't let anybody talk about China in the NBA. If you mention China, and a coach has done that in Texas, he's reprimanded. LeBron James won't say a thing. So how do they square that? They become woke.
Hello, this is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Victor Davis Hanson. Victor Davis Hanson is an American historian, author, and commentator. He is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and today we're going to be talking all about Joe Biden's presidency so far, Donald Trump's legacy, and the Republicans' future in 2024. What's your view on how the Joe Biden presidency is going so far?
Well, I try to just look at empirical reactions. Poll-wise, he had a honeymoon, obviously, after the Trump final month or two, but that has gone down a little bit from 55% to about 52, and some, the conservative polls, he's below 50, but they're probably a little bit more partisan. What I'm looking at is that the expectations that some of us warned others in the middle about, and some on the never Trump right, that Joe Biden was not Joe Biden from Scranton, the old moderate Democrat, but rather either in his older age felt that he had been the understudy of Barack Obama, that he would be a one-term president, that he was underappreciated, and that the way to square all those circles was to be the most radically left vessel since FDR. And that's what I think we've seen. And that means the border is now open. He's recalibrating the Middle East entirely. He's got the biggest array of tax increases and new regulations we've seen in a long time. Culturally, he's weighed in on unnecessarily and gratuitously so, whether it's moving the All-Star game to Denver on specious grounds. He's commented on voting laws that are actually more liberal than his own state, and has called them Jim Crow. So he's wading in as a social justice warrior, even as the concerns about his cognitive abilities have increased because he had the longest hiatus of press conferences of any president. The only thing that's remaining, the only mystery is, will he do what he should have done, and that is pick and choose what Trump did correctly and then take credit for it? And we're starting to see that a little bit on the border, that he's overwhelmed. He's talking about even allowing Trump's wall to continue that was already paid for, that he stopped. I don't think he's quite going to go back to the appeasement of China. We'll see what he does in Iran, but a lot of us have just said, we thought if he was wise, he would just do what Trump had done so successfully before the COVID pandemic, and then take credit for it as if it was the Biden recovery, the Biden vaccine, the Biden boom. But so far, he seems that that's not the case.
Now, to give him some credit, I mean, in the press conference you referred to, obviously he did take a long time to do that, but there weren't any major gaffes, as it were. He hasn't committed any major problems, I don't think, so far. In terms of, you've talked about his cognitive.
I think it's more the prepping that what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
When you had Obama and you had Trump, they were fair game 24/7. So when they got into a helicopter, when they were in a car, when they walked anywhere, they answered almost anything, anytime. Trump, to his own probably fault, but Obama did too. And these are really scheduled press conferences, and a lot of the times the questions are known in advance, if not scripted. And even had, as you know, from this first press conference, he had the pictures of the people he was going to call to, the names, the order, etc. So that's the difference.
And in terms of this overall idea of him being a sort of moderate versus a radical Democrat, I know you're sort of implying that he's being far more radical than he sort of sold himself as. Do you think that's a reality moving forward as we go into the midterms next year, and as voters start to make their minds up about which sort of Senate and Congress people they're going to be voting for, perhaps the Democrats will start to think, well, actually, we shouldn't be so radical on these issues that you talked about, whether it's on increasing taxes or climate change or this?
I think they feel that he is radical, and I think his point of view is, if I was Joe Biden and I would put words into his mouth, he's the following. I'm not going to run for president, no matter what I say at 82. I've only got 4 years. I don't really care about the polls. I don't really care about the midterms. I've got 24 months to ram through an agenda that is the most progressive, the most radical, and will give me the most legacy or bang for the buck in the next 100 years. And I'm going to do that in two fashions. I'm going to do it policy and process. So I can weigh in on social issues, woke. I can call people racist about federalizing the voting statutes of 50 states, which is really unconstitutional. It's only extraordinary, like the 18-year-old vote or women, but not to micromanage voting. That's not in the Constitution. It says that shall be left to the states. And I am going to stop all new energy development. That was a big plus for the US. I'm going to wade in on transgenderism. I'm going to do all of this stuff. And we have a year of pent-up demand. Trump inflated the economy with $3 trillion of stimulus. I came in and added another 2 trillion. I want another 2 trillion. We've got the debt up from when Trump started about 23 trillion. It's going to be 30 trillion. We've got zero interest rates, and we've got a year of pent-up demand. And now it's unleashing because of the quote unquote vaccination. And we're going to have the biggest boom we've seen. And we've already seen it as far as housing sales, car sales, unemployment dropping. And so I think he feels that he's going to take credit for this natural boom and get through this legislation. And that's the policy. The process is to do that. We've never had a president that was that ambitious and radical on either side without a supermajority. And that is, they had a huge landslide victory like LBJ did, or Barack Obama did in the Electoral College, or they had a huge Senate majority like Obama did, supermajority in 2009 when he pushed through Obamacare, or they had a huge House more. Joe Biden is locked 50-50. He has the smallest Democratic majority in this last 50 years. He won or lost the Electoral College by a select 45,000 votes in different states. He had no mandate. And so he wants to change the process. And what do I mean by that? I think they're going to try to get rid of the Senate filibuster. If they can, they would probably want to admit at least one state, maybe Puerto Rico, maybe Washington, D.C. They can get around the Constitution. There are ways of doing it. I think it's unconstitutional, but they can get around it. That would give them 2 more senators. I think they're really seriously talking, as I said, about radicalizing what we've never seen before, the voting systems, so that it's primarily makes irrelevant voting day, election day, an American hallmark day. We went up to 62% of votes cast. We've never done that before. The error rate or the challenge rate or the inauthentic vote rate dropped from a normal 5% of non-election day voting down to less than 1%. It's about 7 or 8 million votes that would have been thrown out under any other system. So that is a radical thing. I think they're discussing maybe 15 Supreme Court justices. That's not in the Constitution. So they can, if they get 51 senators, they can do that with Kamala Harris's vote if they don't have a filibuster. They've talked about statehood for 2 states, packing the court into the filibuster. And there's something called the National Voters Compact to get rid of the Electoral College. Amending the Constitution requires 3/4 of the states and 2/3 of the continent. They're not going to get that, but they can go to individual states and say, vote to accept the popular vote and not your own in-state tally. And if you do that and we get 270 votes, the majority of Electoral College, the Electoral College exists in name, but it's inert. And they're almost there. They've got about 85%. So these are structural changes that they feel will make us more like an Athenian democracy rather than a Roman republic as envisioned by the founders. And that would mean that they could institutionalize a lot of the things they're going to try to do in the next 2 years.
There's so much to unpack there. And, I want to really break down what you've just said. First of all, on the rhetoric, I know the Democrats, have been talking about some of these things for years, packing the courts. A lot of the more radical Democrats have definitely been talking about this for quite a while. Whether they're actually going to be able to do that or will do that is another matter. I think, you can talk about these very radical process changes, structural changes to the system, removing the filibuster, another one. But whether that happens is, another sort of another thing. And, you can speculate about that, I'm sure. But another thing, I know you mentioned the debt there.
Let me just correct you. We've never had anybody who tried to do that. Even during
they haven't tried to do that either yet, have they, though? That's my point.
No, but we've never had a serious group of people say they were going to do that. Let's be clear about that. Every single Democratic candidate who in the Democratic primary, when they were asked, would you pack the court? Joe Biden had some disagreements, but they all said they would. And they all said, every one of them said they wanted to get rid of the Electoral College. We never had that before. We've never had any discussion, serious discussion, as the Senate Majority Leader said the other day, that he wanted Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. admitted. So what they want to do is clear. What they're going to be able to do depends on 2 senators. And there's going to be enormous pressure. You got to remember one other thing. We're talking about a solely political matter. But in this country right now, if you look at the traditional levers of influence and power, not numbers, but money, influence, reach, media, they all are progressive. The university, Hollywood, celebrity culture, Silicon Valley, professional sports and entertainment, etc., the media.
I want to talk about that.
They exercise a degree of influence that's absolutely extraordinary.
And I do want to talk about that slightly later in the interview, but for now, let's stick on this sort of Joe Biden's presidency and sort of what we look forward to. I know one of the things that, you mentioned was the debt, and do you think it's kind of ironic or maybe even hypocritical of Donald Trump supporters or Republicans to talk about Joe Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure plan when Donald Trump added so much to the national debt in the US?
Well, yeah, I said, and I think if you go back, I think I had 3 or 4 columns right in the middle. One of them was called "Debt, the Father of Us All." One of them, they were constant. I think every single column that I have written about the debt has been critical of Donald Trump. Remember what happened. George W. Bush, a fiscal conservative, he raised the debt 75% in 8 years, from 4 to 7. Then Barack Obama doubled it from 7 to 14. And then Trump took 14 and went up 5 to 21 or 22. And he said it was even before COVID, it was going up. And he said that he would eventually, as Reagan said, the huge revenues that ensued, and they did ensue, we had more money coming than ever before. But like Reagan, he didn't make the necessary cuts. Reagan didn't make them in defense. He didn't make them in defense. And he increased it, and he didn't touch entitlements because that was a core tenet of the MAGA agenda, the Social Security for the middle class. Okay, and now we're on a trajectory to trump that. And like Trump, Biden said that these are extraordinary times because of the COVID. But I think one could make the argument that by December or January after the election, we were starting to come out of it. And maybe the Trump stimulus, of which $1 trillion had not been spent, was necessary. But the next $2 trillion and the next after that, you're going to create enormous amounts of liquidity. And we have pent-up demand, and with hyper regulation, you're going to have a lot of dollars chasing a few goods. I'm out here in the San Joaquin Valley. It's poorer than Appalachia per capita income, south of Fresno, California. There is a housing boom like you cannot believe. Houses have gone up 30% in 18 months. There's a shortage of American trucks. Nobody can buy them. They're on demand. I'm talking 50, 60s, $70,000 new pickups. So we're in a boom right now, even with we're not completely out of the lockdown. And gasoline has gone up $1.10 since the election per gallon. So what I'm getting at is this is a natural reaction to the COVID shutdown. And I just wish that Trump had the last few months seen that and Biden had seen it as well, because we're going to get either a stagflation or a radical inflationary period.
Let's get back to this issue of mandate. And this was another point that you made. The Democrats have a very slim majority in both the Senate and in Congress. At the same time, Joe Biden obviously won a lot of votes in the sort of, you know, general population. I think he won, was it about 7 million more than Donald Trump did? You know,
Yes.
that is a significant number of more Americans voting for Joe Biden than Donald Trump. You know, and obviously Donald Trump described his electoral college victory as a landslide. Joe Biden got the exact same, you know, amount of electoral college votes that Donald Trump did in 2016. So the Democrats
Well, first
would
of all,
argue
Trump, yeah,
that they got the mandate to do this stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, he doesn't. I never said that Donald Trump he didn't have a landslide. He had less electoral votes than Obama did. He didn't have a landslide. He lost the popular vote. And he inherited a majority in Congress. He had enough to get through certain things, but he didn't try to change the structure, is what I'm saying. He did not try to change the structure of the system. For all the radical supposed MAGA agenda, if you look at it very carefully, it was a traditional Republican boilerplate with 4 or 5 wrinkles. We're not going to have an open border. And that in 2006, they had already approved 800 miles. That wasn't even controversial. We're going to go back and allow a due process in the Middle East. We're going to get tough with China. We're going to have no more optional wars in the Middle East that don't pencil out. And then we're going to be able to do that because we're going to push energy. That was about all that was different. And then style, of course. So as far as Joe Biden, you can say 2 things. I don't necessarily agree with, but a constitutionalist would say there is no such thing as a popular vote. It doesn't even exist in the Constitution under our system. Each state votes, and then their tallies are individual, and the way that they vote is individual. The times, except for the day of the actual election. As far as Donald Trump got more votes than any losing candidate in history. I don't think that there was enough irregularities to even question the vote. I'm not one of those people. I think that Joe Biden won, but here's the difference. We have never in the history of the United States had 62% of the electorate not voting on election day. And when you have Mark Zuckerberg and Silicon people pouring $500 million into pre-selected precincts, which is pretty much illegal if you read statutory laws, and saying, we're going to help this place in Pennsylvania, this place in Michigan, we're going to get drop boxes, we're going to have the state pay the salaries, and it's only going to be for one purpose, to beat Donald Trump, you've got a problem. So what I'm getting at is, if Donald Trump was right that changes in election hurt him or lost him the election, it didn't happen on election day. It happened from February to May of 2020, when there were literally hundreds of bureaucratic decisions at the state level, executive decisions, gubernatorial decisions, and lawsuits to change the constitutionally mandated right of the legislature to make laws. And they were all done under the pretext of, oh my God, we're facing COVID. Nobody can go out of their home. You can't go to the polls. We've got to have drop boxes. We have to have early voting. We have to have all these mail-in. You cannot ask for an address. If the signature is not there, it won't matter. That's what happened. And the Democrats were much better at it than the Republicans were.
Let's talk about another issue you mentioned earlier, the culture wars. And this is sort of blown up recently to do with voter ID laws in Georgia, the state of Georgia. I think the Republicans there are trying to, you know, bring in laws to make it, you know, they would say to make the elections more valid, because you have to offer your own, you know, identity card before you can vote. And the Democrats are saying, well, look, this is, as you mentioned, this is Joe Biden's rhetoric, is that this is a new Jim Crow law, worse than Jim Crow. This is going to restrict minorities and Black people who generally vote for the Democrats to be able to vote. What do you make of this rhetoric? And also, can you comment on some of the companies, and again, you mentioned this earlier, some of the companies that are beginning to boycott Georgia and have sort of not been quite endorsed by the White House, but not discouraged either?
There's 2 issues here. Has there been an effort de facto or as a result to suppress, say, Black voting? The answer is no. 2008 and 2012, a higher number of African-American registered voters voted than did whites. How could that happen under a system of so-called Jim Crow? Number 2, if you look at the days allowed to vote, the hours in the aggregate that are eligible in early voting, the rules that surround IDs and mail-in voting. And you compare, let's take for an example, two states. Delaware, that Joe Biden ran as a US Senator, basically his machine ran Delaware. And Colorado, which these corporations and the Major League Baseball executives said, we have to move to. We have to move it from an all-black state where we had $100 million in revenue going in to mostly a lily white state, because this state is just passed a restrictive. And you look point by point, you can make the argument that the Colorado voting law, like the Delaware, is more restrictive. So now we get in, why is this going on? And it's going on because radical people in Georgia have been very successful in suggesting there's a racist climate. And out of that dialogue, that frightens people, especially after George Floyd. And so corporations who don't do anything on principle, they're in there to make money. They put their finger to the wind and they say, am I going to get more flack from the 72% of Democrats and Republicans who say that they want an ID, just like you have to get on a plane or a cancer check or get a vaccination? Or am I going to get more flack from the people who were 38%? And it's a no-brainer for them. Antifa, BLM, the universities, all the people we just talked about, they have more ability to pressure us than does the so-called silent 72. So this is what we're going to do. There's not going to be downside. We're going to be woke. We have a younger audience. There's one thing we're also forgetting, and let's be frank. If you look at revenues, domestic revenues of Major League Baseball, or you look at revenues of Major League Basketball, NBA, they are flat domestically. The NBA squared that circle by going to China and has a $5 billion franchising endorsement market now in China, where they're training a whole generation of Chinese, which they will be junked as soon as the Chinese master the system. But for now, it's very lucrative. They don't let anybody talk about China in the NBA. If you mention China, and a coach has done that in Texas, he's reprimanded. LeBron James won't say a thing. So how do they square that? They become woke, and they're very left-wing, and they take a knee, and they lecture, and they take pictures themselves reading. But that's because it's a medieval exemption to justify that they're very illiberal. They are in bed with a country that destroyed Tibet and destroyed democracy in Hong Kong. It's got 1 million people in a re-education camp. Major League Baseball is doing the same thing. Their revenues are flat. Their audience is young. The old traditional viewer is turned off by the politics, and they've made this decision that I don't need a 55-year-old white guy in Michigan to watch baseball. I've got, white people, if I can use that rubric, are now basically 58% of the Major League Baseball, 70% of the population, but underrepresented. NBA is 77% African American. NFL football is, I think, 69%. That appeals to a younger, more diverse, multiracial ethnic crowd. That's our base. They're much more left-wing. We're going to appeal to them, and we're going to get Chinese money. And the more left-wing we sound here in the country, the more we get less flack for being right-wing overseas. And that's how we're going to survive this changing rubric, because they have basically lost all of their traditional viewers. Their viewership has gone down, they're losing money, and they know it, and they've got this new paradigm, and that means they've got a virtue signal nonstop, and that's why it makes no sense, as I said, because the NBA doesn't, the Major League Baseball doesn't care about this voting law. They're incoherent. Fay Vinson, the former commissioner, wrote an op-ed today pointing out how silly his successor is. So it's a business decision. Same thing with Delta Airlines. How can a guy, Mr. whatever his name is, $17 million a year? So if you do it by the working days of the year, he makes $68,000 a day, and he's lecturing the United States that Georgia is racist for requiring an ID, which you have to get on his airplane. And we're supposed to take that seriously as he signed a multi-billion-dollar deal to open up new routes to China. So it's a farce, but it's a clever farce, and it's driven and fueled by profit motives.
Where do you think the president stands on all this? Do you think he is woke himself? And, I know, you might instinctively say yes, but to be fair to Joe Biden and some Democrats, they have been a lot less vocal on these issues. And, there has been some rhetoric about this. I know, we talked about the sort of Jim Crow. That's what Joe Biden is calling these laws, and I think that's relatively exaggerating. You could comment on that, I'm sure. But do you think Joe Biden himself is woke, and do you think there is a split in the Democratic Party still between the more traditional Democrats, the people people like Obama, and these new more radical Democrats, AOC and others?
That question is a little bit more layered than you might imagine, because you're asking me, is he sincerely woke?
Yeah.
Because he surely acts like he's woke. So who was Joe Biden before this year? Joe Biden was Joe Biden from Scranton. He was severely criticized for a lot of his career because he was for efforts to stop school busing. He was the real driver in the Democratic Party, both for walls and border security, but also for increased sentencing for African-American drug dealers. He was called a racist by Kamala Harris. In addition to that, he was a great supporter of James Eastland and the Elder Talmadge, all of the Southern racists and segregationists. He was Delaware. He said in the 2008 primary that he got along with African Americans because Delaware was a formerly slave state. He had, if you want to be empirical about it, he had the worst record of racial gaffes in the country. He said that Barack Obama was the first articulate Black person, and he was clean too. He said that you couldn't go into a donut shop without seeing Indian people. He said during the campaign to an interviewer that was African-American who questioned his cognitive efficacy, he said, "Hey, how would you like it, junkie, if I called you a cokehead?" He said to another interviewer, "If you don't vote for me, you ain't Black." He told people that Mitt Romney was going to put them in chains. These were executives, sophisticated, elegant, completely successful professionals, the cream of American society. He said, if you vote for Romney, they're going to put you in chains as if they were children. I won't even get into the corn pop. So he had a record up until about 3 years ago. Actually, until Obama named it, but even during Obama's, he was known as the gaffe machine. Obama was always worried, about what he would say. So then he made this radical change. And why did he do it? Because he was done for in February. His candidacy was zero. He came in 6th in, I think, Iowa and 4th in New Hampshire. And then we got to see Pete Buttigieg, and we got to see Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Bernie Sanders and the Democratic grandees, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, corporate world. They said, oh my God, these guys could lose to Donald Trump. We need Joe Biden and bring him out because he has this conservative kind of controversial. So they brought him out. He won Nevada. The Black vote helped him in the Carolinas, and he was the leader. And then they thought, we're going to save us with Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg was an utter disaster as a candidate. Spent $1 billion and got nothing for it. So he was repackaged. And here's where it gets interesting. So all of the observers on both sides said, well, he's good old Joe Biden, but he's old and he's had 2 serious brain aneurysms and he's old. So the left is using him as an empty vessel to get him elected and all he's going to do. And I think what happened was Joe Biden said, do I really want to go up against these guys and fight them? They've got control of the media. They've got influence. They got control of Silicon Valley. I don't want to fight them at 78. And maybe I can trump them. So when they bring this stuff, I'm going to take it as my own. I'm going to be bigger than Barack Obama. They're never going to say I was an understudy. And I'm going to get done what Obama did. And you know what? If you read left-wing commentary, that's exactly what they're saying now. Barack Obama is being severely criticized for talking a good game, but good old Joe Biden's actually getting it done through executive orders and through the bully pulpit. And he's going to be far more successful, they think, with a very narrow congressional majority than Barack Obama did with supermajority in the Senate and a huge majority in the House. So that's where he's at now. I don't know to what degree the Obamas are guiding him, but they are the most vocal ex-presidents, first couple we've ever seen. much more than George Bush or Laura Bush, much more even than the Clintons. They weigh in all the time, and they've stocked that administration with a lot of Susan Rice, and a lot of the aides are very prominent in the Obama administration, John Kerry, et cetera. And Jill Biden is I don't know to what degree Jill Biden is active, but she seems to have a role that we have not seen in a long time, much more prominent even than Michelle Obama and Hillary Clinton.
Do you find that there's a sort of irony in the fact that Joe Biden was preceded by Donald Trump, this absolute disruptor of a candidate who had come from absolutely nowhere, had no background in politics, and then obviously Joe Biden beats Donald Trump in the 2020 election. As I say, we talked about the popular vote by a wide margin, at least in the popular vote. And this guy, Joe Biden, is this establishment figure who's been in politics forever. Why do you think that happened? Do you think the sort of American population we'd had enough of this disruptor, we wanted to turn back to normality, as the sort of Democrats would say?
I had a lot of talks with people from the administration, and they were on the impression that January, even though the liberal polls didn't suggest so, but there were enough polls, I think, the Harris-Harvard poll, the Rasmussen poll, and some of the more outlying polls that suggest that Donald Trump was going to get reelected. In January, we had record low minority unemployment, 5.3 for African Americans, lower for Hispanics. The general unemployment was 3.2. We were getting close to 2.8 GDP. We had record energy development. Everybody understood that. And this is what was coming from Democrats. They didn't think they could beat him. And then when you looked at that field that was so hard left, it was polarizing. Had we had an election, and this can happen to any candidate if you pick an arbitrary, but Donald Trump would have been elected. So then we had the pandemic, and then we had the lockdown, and then we had the recession. And those were brilliantly recalibrated as the Trump recession, the Trump pandemic, and the Trump lockdown. Anybody who looked at the situation would have said, this has got all the ingredients of a tragic Western or a Sophoclean play, because Donald Trump took a huge gamble. He bet on 4 different companies. He warped speed. Unlike the EU, he paid whatever they wanted. He helped cover their legal, everything. We got a vaccine in 10 months. And then he unleashed 1 million vaccinations a month when he left after just 5 weeks. And then the economy's natural, after this lockdown that he opposed, he went with it, and it started to heat up again, the economy, right when he left, or right before the election, actually. And the lockdown was starting to crumble in Texas and Florida. So I said to myself, to people that I talked to, I said, you better be very careful about this election, because all of the hard work has been done, and the downside is still there, and the upside is going to come in November, December, January, and Biden's going to take credit, and you're not talking about it. You're not talking about your achievements, energy development, board. What you are talking about is Joe Biden is senile. Joe Biden could be non-existent. He's in a basement, and he's outsourced his campaign to Democratic operatives, the fusion media, Wall Street corporations, and Silicon Valley, and very sophisticated changes in the voting laws. And that's a very difficult. So why Trump was saying, look at, I've got 60,000 people out in Pennsylvania on a cold night. Look at Joe Biden. He's got 10 cars honking their approval. It didn't matter. This was the first virtual candidacy we'd ever seen. It was a virtual campaign, and it was outspent Donald Trump 2.5 to 1. If you look at what the Shorenstein Center had been warning people, they were a liberal Harvard graduate program that monitors media coverage. 90% of mainstream media coverage, Reuters, CNN, it was negative Trump. And so what was happening is the Trump people had fooled themselves that the optics of these rallies and that Trump had done all this good stuff, and everybody would remember pre-COVID. But we were not quite out. Had the election been held, as I said, in January 2020, or right now, with this stuff happening, I think he would have won. But it wasn't. And so I did a lot of interviews on election day and I got a lot of criticism. I said, I don't know who's going to win the election, but I know Donald Trump's not going to win the popular vote. I didn't think he would. I said the electoral college, but the people who were interviewing you on talk radio or blogs or podcasts, they were convinced that Donald Trump was going to win by a landslide, especially when these last polls came in that showed him dead even or ahead, some of them. So yeah, I mean, everybody was shocked, and I still don't know all of the ingredients, but my suspicion is that the voting laws helped Biden, but even more importantly, two things that had not been an issue in 2016, and they were about, they could go either way. One was the swing voter. I would call them the suburban mom, soccer mom, or the professional white guy who makes 150,000 and was bothered by talk of socialism in 2016 or hated the Clintons. They were tired of the Trump tweeting and the Trump disruption. And that, if you're going to attack Fauci, say Fauci's incompetent, but don't say he can't throw a baseball. It's irrelevant. Why do that? And that group turned him. And the Never Trumpers, remember that they had been written off as irrelevant because for all their animus in 2016, 92% of the Republicans voted for Donald Trump, higher than Romney or McCain. And they did so again this election. But what people failed to see was it didn't matter. That was not enough. He got 96% of the Republicans. What he needed was that swing voter, and he lost 2 or 3%. And who were those three swing voters? They were moderates and former Republicans that, in spirit, not registered, who did look at the Lincoln Project's $100 million of, some of it was not all stolen, and ads. They read Never Trump stuff. They read the National Review, and there was about 50 to 80 to 90,000 of them that it did make a difference. So it's not quite fair to say, oh, the Never Trumpers were irrelevant. They were in 2016. They were again for Republicans, but they were very relevant. And so was a sophisticated Democratic plan to target people who were turned off by Donald Trump's optics and communications.
Now,
it was a brilliant campaign.
You've written about history. Let's move on from the campaign, because although that is fascinating, there's so much more to talk about. You've written a lot about history, written about Greek history and things like that. But from a sort of more modern perspective, in terms of Donald Trump's legacy as a president, how historic and impactful was it? When comparing to Reagan, when comparing to these other major presidencies. You can compare Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan and things like that and see, well, look, obviously Ronald Reagan had a much bigger impact. Where does Donald Trump fit on the list of presidents in terms of, the historicness of his 4 years?
You start with the idea that it's very hard for a president, unless you're Lincoln and you're assassinated in the middle of the Civil War, at the end of it, for a 4-year legacy. It just doesn't happen. And, so we got to remember that. Coolidge, remember, took over from Harding, so he had essentially 6 years. So you don't really, that's very hard. But I think there's going to be 2 areas where he will be considered a very successful president. Number one is he recalibrated the dialogue, foreign policy, domestic policy, and the Republican Party to a populist. So the Republican Party, for good or evil, is not caricatured now as a bunch of old white guys on a golf course. They may be, but that's not their caricature. They're now caricatured as, to use Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama's language, it's clingers, deplorables, irredeemables, dregs, chumps, and Neanderthals. And those are all pejoratives for what I would call the white working class of the Middle West. They can't win an election on their own, but they are 30 to 40% of the electorate, and they were neglected. About 8 or 9 million did not vote in 2008 or 12, and they cost Romney and McCain the election. They did vote for Donald Trump. The $64,000 question was there ubiquitous presence enough to win him, because they also turned off your Romney voter. who said, I don't want anything to do with that guy in that monster truck with the American flag on it. You know, I'm more sophisticated and elegant, you know. So that's one thing he did. He changed the party into a populist party, and he tried to promote class rather than race. So if you think about it and prune out all the left-wing, right-wing propaganda, he got a higher number of African-American Hispanic votes than any other Republican, almost more Hispanic, I think, than George W. Bush the first time, but not enough to really make a fundamental difference. But nevertheless, it showed a trajectory. And what his message is, hey, African-Americans, hey, Hispanics, hey, poor whites, you're all in the same boat. You may hate that wealthy guy that's got the big skyscraper, but if the economy goes up, just look at your fuel cost, your electricity cost, your taxes, and your unemployment rate, and employers will be begging for your job. And you can join a union. I have no problem with unions. I'm not like a traditional Republican. If you want to join a union, great. I love union people. I work with them in Manhattan. That was the message. And I'll reduce sentences for African Americans. I will try to campaign with African American people. I will tell Hispanics that you deep down inside want that wall more than I do. Because when you have illegal immigrants coming into your communities, they flood the schools, the English has to be taught to them at the expense of advanced placement. Their gangs pick on your kids that don't speak Spanish. It's not good for you. That started to resonate. So that's an achievement. The other thing is, I think he will be considered as a successful president in foreign policy in this sense, that he really outsourced the mechanics and the nuts and bolts to a very capable, very controversial Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. And Mike Pompeo was the good cop and Trump was the bad cop. So Trump railed and threatened, and then Pompeo quickly came in and said to NATO, look, we're not going to end NATO. Don't listen to that. But listen here. You guys never paid your promise 2% of GDP to defend yourself. Your main threat is Islamic terrorism across the Mediterranean and Russia. And you better pay the 2%, because if you don't, we're not in an alliance, and only one or two of you are, Britain and Greece, I think, and maybe one of the Baltic nations. But it's now 100 million more, and everybody believes, except Germany, and people are not so enthralled with Germany as they were in NATO, that you have to do that. And the alliance is much stronger. Second, in the Middle East, he said the Obama plan was to, as much as they could figure it out, was to enhance Iran as the Persian Shia minority, marginalized, forget Hezbollah, forget Hamas, forget Syria and the Assads, just balance them off against the corrupt Gulf monarchies and put pressure on the right wing in Israel. This is a great tension. And Pompeo said, wait a minute, this is crazy. Israel's a Western country and they're moderates. And they started getting people to recognize Israel. And then they said the Palestinians are not the center of that problem. They're holding hostage 500 million Arabs for what is pretty much a corrupt government. And so we cut aid to the Palestinians, we bypassed them, and we started to make a deal, a de facto alliance, and there was stability. I think Biden will have trouble overturning it. And finally, and most importantly, he said, you Republicans and Wall Streeters, that you think that the more concessions you give China, patent infringement, copyright, theft, technological appropriation, dumping, currency manipulation, huge surpluses, they become liberal and they look at that magnanimity to be reciprocated rather than to earn contempt by our weakness. That's over with. And we're going to be tough with China, and they need us more than we need them. And for all this talk about we're done, they have 1.4 billion people. The United States has 330 million. They've got 4+ times the population. Guess what? We still have almost twice as much conventional GDP as they do. The one American worker is producing twice the goods and services as 4 Chinese counterparts. Whether that's completely accurate or not, but that was his message. And it was one of confidence, and we don't have to, and tried to get the Western world. And of course, the way Trump did it was with theatrics. And then Pompeo came in. And Pompeo, who was running for president, I think did something else. He was trying to say this foreign policy is going to be based on domestic concerns of trade for the working class. We're not going to dump Chinese products. We're not going to outsource. We're not going to say that Germany and Japan, just because you're our World War II allies, you can run up surpluses. And so it was,
I think World War II enemies, I think, to be
yeah.
more.
Well, it was also what was controversial, to be quite frank with you. It was going back to traditional historical alliances. And the left said it was based on race, but I don't think it was. It was based on commonalities. And what I mean by that was he was very, very pro-Australian and said Australia's been a great ally. We got to protect it from China. And he was very pro-Israeli, and he said it's Western. He was very pro-Britain. I don't think the British particularly liked Trump, but boy, on this side of the country, he talked up Britain. I think he was a little hurt probably that he exaggerated the degree to which Boris Johnson may have reciprocated, but he felt at least that he was trying to restore traditional allies that had been shunned before. And he had this idea of a Western civilization alliance and all this stuff with Eastern European countries, former British Commonwealth, etc., as a way of standing up to China, I suppose.
Well, I think
That's
the attitudes I think the attitudes, and talking about Britain's an interesting one, because the attitudes of many in the foreign policy establishment in Britain towards, not just Republicans, but, very radical Republicans or populist Republicans like Donald Trump have, there's been a historic, I think, dislike, and it was difficult for that, for there to be a proper relationship. And I've done a lot of journalistic work around this. But there's lots of other.
You're talking about the Council on Foreign Relations, the Brookings Institute, the Marshall Fund, all of those groups despised him.
Well, look, that's
I just add one thing very quickly.
Yeah.
So when they despised him, we have to ask them what was their contribution to American foreign policy the last 25 years. The brilliant Afghan war, the brilliant Iraq war, was it a brilliant Chinese policy? Was it, you tell me what worked? Was it the Libyan war? Was it the Syrian intervention? I can't think of much that the CIA or the State Department had gotten right the last 20 years. That's what got Trump elected.
Well, look, there's so many more topics I want to touch on before we end. Yeah. So let's move on. This issue of Republicans now representing vast swathes of working class voters is one I want to drill in more. And, on the reverse side of that, the Democrats are now representing, middle class, affluent, young people in cities, people who've gone to universities, well-educated people, yes, people earning higher incomes.
The data shows that.
I don't know how sort of closely you follow British politics, but a very similar path has been trodden here. And, the Conservatives are now way ahead of Labour in terms of working class voters, and Labour are now ahead of the Conservatives in terms of middle class voters. Why do you think this shift has happened? Do you think it's going to be permanent? What's the kind of why has this happened?
There's a number of reasons. They're both real and they involve optics. Let's go to the optics first. Well, let's go to the real questions. In Britain and in the United States, in the last 30 years, as these economies were globalized, in your case, integrated with the EU, but also exporting to China, there were certain skill sets that allowed one to be successful. Because as the markets went from 60 million in Britain to 7 billion on the planet, obviously there was going to be it was kind of comparable to the British economy in the 18th century that just took off. And you see these huge ancestral estates all over Britain. That was all built during a 100-year period in many cases. So the same thing happened in the United States. In the United States and in Britain, it was the London crowd, and here it was the bi-coastal. So we here in California, if you were in Silicon Valley and Stanford University and USC and UC Berkeley and UCLA and et cetera, Google, Facebook, Apple, you looked out toward Asia. And where I work at Stanford University, if I ask some of my colleagues or friends in Silicon Valley, what's the best restaurant in Beijing, or where do you like to go in Seoul, they can tell me. If I say 140 miles away, there's a big city called Bakersfield. Have you ever been there? Never been there. Have no idea what exists. And the East Coast, it was the EU. And so the academic elite and the government elite and the media elite looked out toward Europe. And we created an international group of people who had the skill sets: insurance, law, media, technology, finance, corporate, and they made more money than the history of civilization. But there was a downside. When you offshore and outsource and you liberalize trade and you make it completely free but not fair, or I should use the word symmetrical, people who have muscular labor and depend on it, small farmers, lathe workers, car workers, their product is outsourced. Xerox, where it's cheaper labor. China, what used to be here, sent out to Germany and Japan, then was sent out to Southeast Asia and Korea, then it was sent to China. And so we wiped out that swath. And worse yet, we made a rationalization that confused cause and effect. We said, if you're overweight and you're no longer a $30 an hour lathe worker in Southern Michigan, it's because you're just stupid. You didn't learn to code. You didn't get with it. You didn't get your degree in public relations. You didn't get your daughter to go into insurance or law. And you didn't even, if you're still that stupid, you didn't follow the fracking rigs from down to Texas or the Dakotas. So there was a contempt for that group. And we made up, as I mentioned, these labels for these people. And when you look at middle class wages in Britain and especially in the United States, they had been flat under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. They soared on 3% in 1 year under Donald Trump, or at least 2 years. And so there was a sense that we are losing out, and these elites who are globalized, the Davos crowd, they're doing better than ever, and they have nothing but contempt for it. And then to finish, there was a wrinkle. The more that these people became cosmopolitan, and the more they had money, and the more they had tasteful, they were worried about granite counters and stainless steel kitchens and all of these magazines about the place to be and what kind of dress and what type of appurtenances and what kind of car. Is it going to be Lexus, Mercedes, Volvo, Range Rover? I never saw a Range Rover in my life until 2005. All of a sudden, Palo Alto and Silicon Valley are full of them. They're no different than a Ford that copied them. There's a Ford version that looks just like it. They're probably more reliable, but nobody would buy that if you can get a Range Rover. Okay. That whole crowd, by any Marxist definition, was parasitic. That's what Marx would say. So they were worried about that. So the Democratic Party started under Bill Clinton, but especially under Obama, to cater to those people, but to introduce them to wokeness, to say that, you know what, you may not, you can have if you're Barbara Streisand, put a big wall around your house, but say you're against the wall on the border. I once taught at Pepperdine, and I had to pull over on the PCH in front of Barbara Streisand's house, and I was almost arrested immediately by her security guard outside this huge wall, the day that she had been railing about walls. And if you hate, you can hate teachers' unions. And I mean, you can support teachers' union, you can hate anti-union efforts, you can hate charter schools, but it's okay to put your kid in a private academy. They popped up like rabbits all over Silicon Valley. The most segregated, elitist academy. They do in Britain, as you know, those old schools are coming back. And I could go down the line. The point I'm making is that the left said to the wealthy and the privileged, your abstract wokeness and your money and your influence is a sort of medieval indulgence or penance. And that allows you in your own personal lives to be anybody you want to be, as indulgent, as selfish, as narcissistic as you want. And they all did this. And anybody could see the emperor had no clothes, that somebody was going to come along, even if it was a billionaire. And they didn't understand. They said no billionaire could ever appeal to these poor, deplorable. But he wasn't a billionaire just. He was orange skin, comb over, Queen's accent. He appealed to working people. He hated those people. These were the bankers who said Trump, no. These were the insurance people. These were the lawyers that he dealt with. He despised them. And so he made that argument, and it caught fire in 2016. And everybody was shocked about the resentment that people had. I teach in Southern Michigan, and I traveled the Middle West during the 2016 election. I had no idea that people over there felt like they did in the southern San Joaquin Valley where I live, that they despise those people. When I go to rural Fresno County, I don't tell anybody I work at Stanford University. They'll say, hey, don't you work over there in the coast? I say, yeah, once in a while. When I'm in Palo Alto, they think that you should be dead and buried if you have to live in Fresno County. So this red-blue divide, it's everywhere in the West. And it's a product, you can adjudicate it or find the metrics by zip code. Look at the zip code and compare income with political affiliation. You can look at the mayors of cities. You can do it by polling income, who they prefer. The Republican Party under Trump, but I think even without him, it would have been that way, is the upper middle class and all the way down to the lower middle class. And the Democratic Party is the upper middle class, the very wealthy and the very subsidized poor. And that's the way it is.
It's funny because, you mentioned Donald Trump being a billionaire and winning over these working class voters. So, in the UK, you've got Boris Johnson, and this guy who went to Eton as in sort of the heart of the establishment managed to win over, again, so many working class people. And I think a lot of Labour politicians were very sort of scratching their heads at this, thinking, how could this really posh guy who doesn't hide the fact that he's really posh win over all these working class voters? I want to ask two quick questions.
How do you think he does? Don't you think it's partly because, unlike Justin Trudeau, he looks like a slob, and sometimes he says things that
I think
are
he's
very
authentic. I think that's what wins people over. And Donald Trump was the same in a way. It doesn't really matter what your background is, as long as you're sort of true to yourself. I think that's really powerful to voters. Two quick questions before we end, though. One on sort of the upcoming elections in the US. 2022 midterms, got the 2024 presidency, obviously. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the Republicans' chances? Are there any front runners in terms of people who should run for the presidency? I know it's a long time away, but these things, I know American elections last a very long time. One of the candidates people are talking about is Ron DeSantis, and then on the sort of more establishment side, there's Nikki Haley. Have you got any thoughts on those elections?
Very quickly, in the 2022, I'm not as optimistic as most Republicans. They feel, because of the outrage at the border and the activism on the Biden social and cultural questions, he's alienating. He is, but most voters on the midterm elections vote on their pocketbook. And whether it's fair or not, the president that's in power will get credit. If you look at the trajectories in the United States, some days we are vaccinating 3.5 to 4 million people. If you look at the trajectory, somewhere around June 1st, we're essentially going to have 10 to 15 million, 30 have COVID, have had it, another 60 to 90 have antibodies. We have 170 vaccinated. We're going to be up to 250. We got 40 million that are below the age of 12. We're going to have immunity very quickly. And that, who gets credit? Joe Biden will get credit. We're going to have no lockdowns. They can say all they want about the lockdowns, but when you get down to here in California with 40 million people, and we're getting down to some days 60 or 70 dead, or I'm in a 1.4 million person county that had 180 dying a day or 200, and now 0 deaths for 4 days, Biden will get credit. And then when you look at the GDP figures and unemployment I think we're going to have a crash, but it won't come. So I think that it's going to be very closely fought. I'm not sure at all Republicans, unless Biden does something even crazier. So that's up in the air. As far as the Republicans, I think it's just gospel now that whatever person runs will run on a MAGA agenda. That is, we will not have any Jeb Bushes saying that illegal immigration is an act of love. You will not have any free market Milton Friedman people said, oh, you know what, just the market will level it out. Don't worry about unfair trade. You will not have anybody saying, you know what, we've got to go nation build in Syria or something. It's not going to happen. So then the question is, what is going to happen? And that we had Nikki Haley, who was probably of all the candidates, the most charismatic and canny, but she thought she could very early cut the umbilical cord with Trump, and that failed. She had to kind of grovel, and then she made it worse when he said, no, I don't want to talk to you. So I think that established the idea that all of these candidates are going to run. They're very good candidates. They're better than I think we've ever had them. Some, like DeSantis, have actually run something like a state. but Pompeo and Tom Cotton and Christie, no, they're all good candidates, but they have a rendezvous with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, I think at this point, he's recovered from his nadir of January 6th, but I don't think people in the party believe he can get 51% of the popular vote. So they're thinking, if we get everybody united, we'll get 46% of the popular vote again, or 47. So is there any way that we can tell Donald Trump at 78 that you saw Joe Biden at 78, you're going to be that age. Why don't you be a senior statesman and help unite the party and go behind somebody and I think that's what they're secretly thinking. Now, it doesn't take, you don't have to be an American to see whether that's going to work or not, because Donald Trump is an enigma. And he could be so successful, he could be he could have a candidate, he could say, you got to go out and vote for DeSantis. And I like Christie Noem, what an ideal ticket. And he could look at those polls and see them 10 points ahead of Biden or Harris or whoever it is. And then all of a sudden he said, oh my God, if they're that ahead, I could be 20 points ahead and jump in. So to sum up, 50-50 on the 2022 election as it is now, with a qualifier that a lot of things will change, it's so early, but on the 24 election, everybody has to make their peace with Donald Trump. Donald Trump has to play a role, but I think people in the party are trying to explain to him that it's better for his legacy and himself at 78 if he helps a successor rather than he jumps in himself, given all the things we discussed today.
Thank you so much, Victor, for your time. And I hope to, have you on again and stay in touch.
Yeah.